Hello, heroes and hamlets. My name is TB's Guide, and we are still talking a little bit about the Shadow Isles in preparation for the presumably soon upcoming Mordekaiser rework. Now, Riot have been cleaning up the Shadow Isles a little bit. They've been touching up bits of the lore. They've been editing a few things about people's bios and stuff like that. That implies to me that when Mordekaiser arrives, he's going to bring with him a substantial lore update for the Shadow Isles. So in preparation for that, we've been cataloging the old state of the Shadows, like the before state, before Mordekaiser comes and messes with a whole bunch of things. And once he's out, well, of course, we'll follow up and discuss how things may have changed or not have changed, as the case may be. I'm hoping for change, personally. Anyway, in the process of that, it's finally become time to talk about Yorick, a very old champion who's been with League of Legends for a long time, but who had himself a lovely modernizing rework a couple of years ago now that did a decent job of bringing him into line with the modern aesthetic of League of Legends. Now, we will talk a little bit about who he was and what was up with him pre-rework and compare it a little bit to his current character design, because it's ties into a point that I want to bring up with Mordekaiser as well, which we'll follow up on also on the channel at some point later on down the line. But mostly we'll do the normal thing. We will talk about his lore to start with, like the stories, the writing that's associated with him. Then we'll move on to talk about whether or not his character design does a good job of expressing that story. So, Yorick, the Shepherd of Souls, then. So Yorick is a child in a fishing village, like out in the boonies, out in the sticks, some hole in the ground on the side of the coast that catches fish for a living. He's also, unfortunately, the protagonist of the movie The Sixth Sense. He can see dead people, which is unusual, and not a thing that most kids have to deal with in their lives. He can see dead people, he can talk to dead people, and that, as you may imagine, screws up several aspects of his life rather substantially. Everyone else around him thinks that he's either weird or, like, just freak because he goes around talking to, air quotes, himself all the time. His parents thinks he's just having nightmares. Nobody ever really believes that he can talk to the dead because, first of all, why would they? And second of all, they can't see the dead or talk to them themselves. So, yeah, it's a little bit of a problem. And Yorick is kind of bummed out by that, again, as you would be if you were a kid and you had to deal with that crap. Like, puberty was hard enough. You have to deal with the dead as well. Like, his grandma coming back watching him like, ugh, creepy. Anyway, he eventually figures out that the dead spirits that come to him aren't really there to be jerks to him. They're not there to hurt him. They're not there to scare him. They are frightened, or they are confused, or they are unable to move on to the afterlife for whatever reason. And so, as a means, perhaps, of coping, he takes it on himself to guide them, escort them to the other side, help them move on from the mortal realm into whatever follows next. And that's sort of just what he spends his time doing. Now, eventually, word of that kind of activity reaches the monks of the Blessed Isles. Some of the monks, anyway. There's a lot of monks on the Blessed Isles. These ones are specifically the Brethren of the Dusk, and they come to Yorick and are like, hey, we hear that you've been spending some time talking to the dead and helping them move on to the other side. Tell you what, though, we're monks, and we also specialize in talking to the dead and helping them to the other side. We should totally hook up and collaborate, man. We should put that on YouTube. And they offer Yorick a place in their order. And Yorick is like, well, oh, a place I can belong where everybody doesn't think I'm weird. That sounds cool. So he goes along and becomes a monk. And then it turns out, well, there's no one else at the monastery can actually talk to the dead the way that Yorick can. They just have rituals and religious stuff and like rites and magic and stuff that helps them help the dead move on, but none of them can actually talk to the dead. So everybody still thinks Yorick is weird and kind of don't want to hang out with him. So Yorick is kind of bummed out about that, but at least now he's got like this sweet gig being a monk and burying people in graves and stuff. Then the Ruination happens, which, like, things are not super great for Yorick, but like they get substantially more screwed up after the Ruination because everything and everyone dies, except for him. Now the monks, the Brotherhood of the Dusk, carry with them at all times a vial of holy water around their neck. The water from one of the sacred springs of the Blessed Isles. These are called the Tears of Life, which are really powerful life-giving waters that are actually part of the reason why the Ruination happens, is that the ruined king wants the waters of life, can't get the waters of life, and when he finally does manage to revive his wife with the waters of life, she's a zombie and she's not jazzed about it, so he casts a bad spell, everything goes to hell, the Blessed Isles are ruined forever. So, yeah, so all of that. The Ruination sweeps across the Blessed Isles, turning them into the Shadow Isles, and the other monks in the Order are overcome with a urge, a terrifying fear that forces them almost to tear the blessed vials off their necks and throw them away, at which point the Black Mist overtakes them and kills them and consumes their souls, because that is what it does. Yorick, however, because he can talk to and understand the spirits of the dead, understands that, oh, right, the reason why they're all throwing away the magic life water that would save them is because the mad spirits of the Black Mist is literally driving them insane by screaming spirit language at them and forcing them or frightening them into throwing away the waters of life. Yorick, because he knows what's going on, is able to restrain himself and keeps the waters of life around his neck, and when he wakes up after the Black Mist has washed over everything, he's in the Shadow Isles and everything is bad. So Yorick tries to find survivors, he tries to find out what the hell has happened there, and manages to find out the stuff about the ruined king and the queen and the waters of life and the cataclysm, yada yada yada, and decides, okay, we need to do something about this. He also figures out that because he can talk to the dead, because he can communicate with them, he has a certain amount of power over the Black Mist. He has a certain amount of power over the dead of the Shadow Isles. He can infuse Black Mist into corpses and command them to move around and help him. And that's, you know, that's necromancy. That's Karthus stuff. Like, that's what all of the bad, evil, undead champions, like, that's what causes them to happen, what they are interested in doing. And Yorick is like, well, this is morally bad, probably, but it's also a tool I can use to maybe reverse the Ruination and bring back the Blessed Isle, so let's do it anyway. And that leads us on to his associated color story, Last Rites. It's a fairly simple story. Yorick finds a man who has been shipwrecked and washed out on the Shadow Isles. He's completely screwed up. He's very injured. He's definitely going to die if he doesn't get some help. Yorick tries to treat him with whatever medical supplies are not rotten after hundreds of years of being stuck on the Shadow Isles. Doesn't really work. So then he considers, okay, there is a way for me to save this man. I have these waters of life. If I give them to him, he might have a chance at survival. But then he's like, yeah, but if I give them to him, then I die. I'd have to sacrifice myself for him, and I have an important mission to carry out, so I'm not going to sacrifice myself for him. I'm just going to let him die. So he lets him die, then he revives him as a zombie and sends that zombie off to help him gather information about the Ruination, hoping that he might find some way to reverse the process and bring back the Blessed Isles. The point of all of this is that Yorick is supposed to be a somewhat morally ambiguous character. Like, he does try to save the guy, but when it becomes clear he can't, he's not willing to self-sacrifice in order to save this man's life, partly reasoning that the guy is probably going to die on the Shadow Isles anyway, and it will all be kind of wasted, so let's just let him die. So he's not really a moral absolutist in that sense, and he's not necessarily a 100% good guy. This comes across also in... Gonna have to make it a little bit bigger so we can see it. In his little blurb here. This is not part of his bio, necessarily, but it's a blurb that's sort of supposed to sum up the character. And what it says is, trapped on the Shadow Isles, his only companions are the rotting corpses and shrieking spirits that he gathers to him. Yorick's monstrous actions belie his noble purpose to free his home from the curse of the Ruination. So, Yorick is a dude who does necromancy, who uses zombies, so uses the dead as weapons, as tools in order to get what he wants, which is an end to the Ruination. He is doing very, very bad things in the service of a good principle, or at least that's the idea. So how does that come across in his character design? Well, Yorick is a character design that it's kind of hard to say very much about, because it's just kind of fundamentally very competent. It's just, fundamentally, it's just a pretty darn good character design. And, so there's a few elements to Yorick, right? There is the thing that he's an undertaker. Like, he's a monk who deals with, you know, the dead people and burying people and ushering them onto the afterlife and keeping graveyards nice and stuff like that. And to that end, he has a big, giant shovel. But it's not just, you know, a random shovel. It's a shovel that is clearly ceremonial in some description. It's clearly made for some kind of very specific purpose. You can tell that from all the elaborate design elements that are on it. The little tassels that are attached to the handle, the, you know, very deliberate shape of the pommel there, the very extremely deliberate shape of the shovel head itself, and that eye motif that is showing up not only on the shovel, but literally all of Yorick's all the stuff that he's wearing has these eye motifs sort of put into the texture work on the objects. So there's this sense that this is not just a shovel, but a very important ceremonial shovel. It might have some kind of a religious purpose, and because it's branded with this iconography over and over and over again, you get the sense that it's a branding that belongs to a certain organization or a certain faith or a certain group of people. So far, so good, right? That's already telling us a lot about what the character is functionally supposed to be. Then there's his general outfit. First of all, there's the hood that he wears over his head, or it looks kind of like he's just draped a towel over his head, actually. But, you know, he's got a hood on over his head, which is a very universal symbol of monks and religious orders and stuff like that. People who wear hoods over their heads and robes and stuff like that. Commonly associated with monkhood, with religious orders, and the like. Then there's his general outfit, which, as I said, it's covered in this iconography that ties him to some kind of religious order, which is also, you can see he's wearing fairly sensible boots and sensible pants, which again tells us something. Okay, this man is someone who does practical work. Specifically, he's a gravedigger. Like, he's a guy who spends time walking around in mud and earth and soil, so of course he has fairly sensible clothing. But he's also got this vest kind of thing going on with this little, I don't know what they're called, this little banner that hangs between his legs, that looks a little bit too formal and fancy to just be like civilian clothing, so it looks like it is some kind of uniform of something specific, again, combined with all the iconography. It's very clear that this man is probably some description of monk, some description of religious person, some description of something to do with digging graves, or at least digging holes. So all of this is extremely effective. Then he's wearing the pendant around his neck, which in-game it glows a lot more than it does in the model viewer, which is clearly magical of some sort, and the way that he's wearing it makes it look like some kind of religious pendant or something like that, an amulet maybe, which is what it is. All of that very effective as well. Then we have this right here. This is, I believe, where he calls the Maiden of the Mist from, his ultimate attack. And it has this very specific half-moon shape to it, which gives him that very peculiar profile, that unusual shape, which almost looks like a religious symbol of some sort, especially when you view him from the front or in profile, which again does a good job of heightening the religious implications of his character design. Then there's the little detail that the Maiden of the Mist is crying. A statue that is crying, usually you'll hear about that in terms of like a statue of the Virgin Mary crying blood or whatever, but a statue that is crying is imagery that is very, very, very commonly associated, especially with Christian mythology, but also just with religiosity in general, because getting water from a stone is, of course, a type of miracle. The manacles that he's wearing, or the bracers that he's got around his arms as well, also do a good job of indicating that he's belonging to some kind of religious order, while the sensible fingerless gloves that he's wearing, again, indicates that he's someone who works with his hands. So all in all, Yorick's design is just really effective and quite good. His color scheme ties him to the Shadow Isles. He's got all the teal, the brown, the grays, the purples, and the blues going on that are very much the Shadow Isles sort of color scheme that ties champions to undeath and to the Shadow Isles, but he's not so pale, so blue and gray that he looks like he's dead himself necessarily, just that he's been living in darkness for a very long time. So all in all, Yorick, very effective character design, just a very competently executed character design. You can tell what the character is about, you can tell what kind of attitude he has just from the very happy look on his face, and you can tell what it's about. And there's the lovely little detail that the hood over his face also gives us this powerful shadow over his eyes. Now, a common visual signifier of a character keeping secrets, or not being forthright, not being obvious, or, you know, being somehow hypocritical or telling some kind of lie, is to conceal their eyes, especially to conceal their face. You see this done in anime all the time when a character has a dark thought, or they're hiding some kind of secret, or you're not supposed to really know what's going on inside them when they're supposed to be inscrutable. Anime will commonly hide the eyes of the character, and it's exactly the same thing that's going on here. When you leave the eyes in shadow, you give the impression of someone who's perhaps not 100% honest, not perhaps 100% forthcoming, not perhaps 100% a good guy. Whereas if you want to design a stereotypical good guy, you will give them a broad, open face, big eyes, and if you want to be even more extra about it, you open up their coat and kind of you show their chest, like you show their naked honesty, you show their heart, you make them vulnerable in some way. And what Yorick is very much not, what his character design, his posture, everything about the way that he's rendered, his outfit, the religious symbology on him, the iron stuff that he's wearing, what all of that is not is vulnerable. Yorick does not look vulnerable by any definition of the word because, you know, again, he's not necessarily 100% good guy. All in all, Yorick is just a really fantastically, competently executed character design. Now, I'm not necessarily 100% a fan of his lore, because it's like, he's been alive for like hundreds of years on the Shadow Isles, and he has magical superpowers that lets him control the undead. And yet, in this story, which takes place, like, close to the present day, I think, of League of Legends, he's still like, I mean, I've just been spending the last 500 years sending zombies to the middle of the island and hoping they come back with some kind of answer for me. That hasn't worked. I wonder what I will do now. Like, that felt a little bit weak in terms of giving us an insight into what Yorick is even doing to try and reverse the Ruination. Because it doesn't really seem like he's doing anything. He doesn't really seem to be an active agent on the Shadow Isles. He doesn't really seem to be actively working against people like Thresh or Hecarim or indeed Mordekaiser, who may turn out to be the overlord of the Shadow Isles or something along those lines. He's just kind of there, being like, I should definitely do something about the Ruination. It's not clear that he has. It's not clear that he has made any kind of a difference for the hundreds of years that he's been stuck on the Blessed Isles. I also think in terms of the lore, the story, the whole point of Yorick's story is that he's this kid who can talk to the dead, right? That's his special power, is that he can relate to the dead better than anyone else. He can communicate with them. He can make them act better than they otherwise would. Like, he can help them move on to the other side. He can calm them down. He can cause some kind of healing for the dead. That's thematically a very interesting thing to bring into a world where undeath is a thing, where zombies are a thing, where, you know, the living dead are a thing. But it's not really used to do anything thematically interesting. All it's used to do is give him an excuse to be able to raise zombies for himself. Where, in terms of the storytelling around him, I would like to see more about, like, maybe his way of trying to cure the Ruination would be that he talks to the spirits of the Black Mist and tries to help them move on, tries to help them find peace, and he reduces the Black Mist by literally shepherding the souls inside the Black Mist onto the next life. Or something, like something that makes active use of his unique capacity to calm the dead, to move them on, to help them find peace, in order to combat the effects of the Ruination, in order to reduce the power of the Black Mist. Like something that's just more than, oh, this is why he can raise zombies. And part of that is because he only has this short story. Like, this is literally the only lore other than his bio that exists about Yorick. And that's always the problem with the League of Legends, is they release some champions, and they give them, like, an interesting backstory, and they give them, like, a short story, and then it's like, okay, I guess we're moving on now and never doing anything else with this character ever again for 10 years, until it's time to reboot them or rework them or whatever. That's the League of Legends' constant problem, and Yorick is certainly affected by it. Speaking of, reworking champions and stuff, Yorick's old character design. I wanted to bring it up because it ties into something I've talked about on the channel before. A while ago, I made a video called something along the lines of No More Ugly Champions, where I talked about how the updates to Swain and Urgot in particular had removed a character's roots as being these very ugly, unappealing, kind of weird, off-putting characters and turned them instead into power fantasies of various kinds. Like, Swain was turned from this hobbled old man who kind of, like, staggers around the battlefield, and he's like, bald and kind of grimy and grody, and he's got this long nose, and he's got this weird cover around his mouth, and he's always kind of off-putting and weird and like, not very pleasant. And then he gets turned into, like, sexy daddy Lucius Malfoy kind of character, like, who looks all dignified and cool, and like, oh yes, I am the clever farseer who knows and understands more than anyone else, and I've got this badass demon hand and stuff like that. Which, like, it's like, it's not a bad character design, but it's sanded off all the interesting edges. It's a character design that's designed much more to be appealing, rather than being designed to be charismatic or interesting. And the same thing goes for Urgot, who used to be this horrifying, stitched-together bag of meat on legs, kind of shambling across the battlefield. I'm gonna kill you. Like, ugly, disgusting pus oozing from every pore. And then, like, he gets turned into this badass underground rebellion leader who's, like, gonna teach Noxus the true meaning of power. Like, this dangerous, powerful, badass cyborg character on legs. It's like, big, strong muscles, and I'm cool, and I have ideological convictions and stuff like that. Again, not a bad character design, but all of the edges, all of the unpleasantness, everything about him that was unappealing was kind of smoothed away from him. And Yorick is another example of that process in action, because this is what Yorick used to look like. Well, this is, and then he had a texture update that made him a little bit less grody and kind of ugly to look at. And the old Yorick was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a better character design than new Yorick. Like, old Yorick was a mess, a complete mess. You can kind of see the detail overload just happening on him. Like, he's got this stitches, like rags hanging over his head, and he's got this big humpback thing going on, and he's got this lantern hanging off his back, and he's got, like, bandages wrapped all around. He's got this arm thing on that don't know what the hell that is, and this shovel that just looks weird and peculiar and doesn't really go anywhere. He's this completely shambolic mess of a character design. He looks more like a zombie than a person, right? He looks like he's undead himself in some sense, which I can't remember his old lore. He might actually have been undead. But what this character design is, even though it's definitely not a better character design than New Yorick, who is by every measure of and every definition I have of a good character design, a much stronger, much more cohesive, much more well put together character design, he's also a lot less interesting. I see this guy as a character designer, and I'm like, okay, that is freaking weird and off-putting, and is like kind of badly put together and strange, and like that's interesting at least. Like, what's the concept here? Why does he look like such a mess? What's going on there? There's on looking at him, this character design is more interesting to me than this one. This guy looks kind of generic because he's so smoothed out, because he's so polished, because he's so well crafted. He looks kind of generic. He looks like anyone could like any big company could have made him. Blizzard could have made him. Any of the EA studios could have made him. He doesn't really look very specific to League of Legends. This guy, though, he looks much more like something that belongs only in a League of Legends game. Like, he's still not super incredibly unique, but he looks more unique than this guy, who could be a World of Warcraft character. And like, if someone told me he was a World of Warcraft character, I wouldn't even bat an eyelid. I'd be, yeah, that makes sense. That he does look like that. And that's the reason I'm bringing all this up. Partly is just to comment on the fact that Yorick used to be more interesting in his visuals, where now he's more interesting perhaps in his lore concept. It's the thing about that is, like, a Mordekaiser. I lost my train of thought there for a second. What I wanted to talk about was the upcoming Mordekaiser rework, because we haven't seen much of it. Like, we've seen, like, it was a leak of like an icon based on what he might be looking like, what his new design might be looking like. But what I saw of that was this same process happening over again. Like, old Mordekaiser, and I've talked about him on the channel before, is kind of a terrible character design by a lot of definitions. He looks like a roided up Skeletor combined with the most generic evil overlord design you could ever possibly think of, and then someone dropped like a ton of scrap metal on him and hammered a bunch of nails into his armor for no good reason, so it's just spiky all over, and it's kind of bad and silly and dumb. But the new Mordekaiser character design looks like it's a completely smoothed out version of that. It's like it got all the silly, too many spikes, too much edgy, edgelord bullshit kind of filed off it. And what I'm worried about is that we're going to see Yorick happen all over again with Mordekaiser, where we'll get a new character whose narrative is much more interesting, who's thematically more interesting, who's much better tied into the world of Runeterra and the story of the Shadow Isles and stuff like that, but who is, in terms of his character design, painfully much more generic. Painfully much more, oh, that guy could be in literally any video game. And that's kind of the worry I've had for League of Legends for a long time, is that they're kind of heading in the direction where they all just look like that generic, like, online game that you see in an ad on the side of your browser where there's some pretty fantasy girl going, "Play now, my lord," with some stupid city builder game or something. I'm worried it's moving towards that very slick, polished corporate aesthetic, and kind of erasing all the imperfections and strange edges and weird concepts that made League of Legends so aesthetically interesting to begin with. Anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent that I went on kind of mostly because Yorick himself was not actually... didn't have that much about him to talk about, because he's kind of a boring, well-executed character design in a lot of ways. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, you should feel free to hit the like button, and the subscribe button, and the bell icon, and also leave a comment down below, because all of that is numbers, and it makes the numbers go up, and then YouTube lets me have a YouTube channel still, and lets people see my videos. And I hate having to ask about it every time, but it works to ask about it, and so we keep asking about it. YouTubers wouldn't do this if we didn't have to, I promise you. Also, if you want to support the channel directly, then there is Patreon for that specific purpose, where you can head on over, sign up for a monthly subscription if you want to. And as I say at the end of my videos, even $1, like, that you contribute directly to a content creator instead of just ad revenue, $1 can be the same as 1,000 views or 2,000 views, even depending on who it is you're dealing with. So even a very small contribution can make a world of difference to a content creator. Whether it's me or it's someone else that you like on YouTube or just an online content creator of any kind, even very small donations can matter a great deal. If you don't want to sign up for a monthly subscription, of course, then there's also a couple of tip jar links down below where you can just give me a one-time tip and say, hey, that was a good job on doing that video thing that you did. I enjoyed that. That was fun. I like it. Here's $1 to tell you how much I liked it. Again, small contributions like that make a lot more difference than you might otherwise think. Of course, if you can't do that, I completely understand. Money is tight all over. If you just don't want to, I also completely understand, because, like, a lot of stuff we could spend our money on, and I completely get if online content creators isn't one of the things that you want to spend your money on. That's fine. It's enough that you watch the videos. Like, that's the baseline of support that we are all very grateful for. If you haven't enjoyed this video, well, feel free to hit the dislike button down below as well, although I don't know if this has been happening to you, but I watched a Disney video. Like, I watched like a video of like a song from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and YouTube immediately decided that I should get nothing but children and baby videos for the next 3 days. Just like nursery rhymes and baby toy reviews and these things have like 70 million views. What the hell is even going on? Anyway, just all of us. So I just like, okay, fuck, goddamn, I need to tell YouTube not to send me that stuff. So I went to all those videos and I clicked the dislike button, and the dislike button, and the dislike button, and the dislike button, and the dislike button, just to tell the algorithm to leave me the hell alone. But every time I clicked the dislike button, it was, I don't know, it's like right at the edge of my hearing. You know, sometimes when you feel like you're sort of hearing a voice from someone, like from the next room or something, but you can't quite make out what it's saying. I just heard, and every time I clicked the dislike button, it just got a little bit louder, and I almost started clicking dislike buttons just so I could make out what it was saying, but the more I felt like I could hear it, the more I just got the feeling that whatever that is, I shouldn't know what that voice is saying. It's not something I should hear. So anyway, the point of me telling you, if you've been clicking dislike buttons recently, you've been noticing the same thing, please let me know down in the comments, because I'm kind of weirded out whether that's just me or whether it's like if it's a new feature on YouTube. I don't know. Just if you've been hearing those voices yourself, I just be careful how many dislike buttons you click, because I tell you from experience that you don't want to be lying awake at 2 a.m. at night and click a dislike button on your phone, and from somewhere way too close, you hear a voice tell you a secret that you should never, ever have heard. Thank you very much for watching.